Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. This episode is an interview about political legitimacy. My guest for it is Fabienne Peter. She is a professor of philosophy at the University of Warwick in the UK, specialising in moral and political philosophy and in social epistemology, including political epistemology. Relevant to this conversation, she's also the author of The Grounds of Political Legitimacy. I really enjoyed this conversation and I learned a lot from doing it, so I hope you get a lot out of it as well. We set up the topic in the interview, so I'm not going to do a long introduction here. I'll briefly mention on the side that recently I've had a bunch more people signing up to support the podcast on Patreon. So I just wanted to say I'm really grateful for that and thank you for doing it. As you may know, I don't do any advertisements on the podcast, I don't have any sponsorships, so all of this is made possible by the voluntary support of listeners. So thank you so much for the people who've just done that. Thank you for the people who've been doing it all along. And if you are able to and you enjoy this show, consider supporting. You can do that at patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, and links to everything else to follow the show, follow on social media or on the website politicalphilosophypodcast.com. Apart from that, let's get straight into it. This was a really fun conversation that I'm excited to bring you. This is Political Legitimacy with Fabienne Peter. Okay, I am joined today by Professor Fabienne Peter. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So just to get started, what do you read and write and teach and think about? What's like a very short introduction to you?
I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Warwick, and my areas of specialty are political philosophy, which is related to the podcast today. I also work in moral philosophy, in ethics, and particularly meta-ethics, or at least more recently, I've started to work quite a bit in meta-ethics. I have interest in social epistemology, including political epistemology and moral epistemology. I did start out in economics department, spent some time in the School of Public Health. So basically, I took the scenic route to philosophy.
Okay, fantastic. We're going to do legitimacy today. I'll admit, this isn't one, I was saying before we came on, I've been doing the podcast for a while now. This isn't one I've spent a lot of time on or covered on the podcast, so you'll have to lead me through this. To start with, do you have a starting point, like with the proviso that these big political terms often lack tight definitions and necessary and sufficient and all that? And we'll get on to what your account of legitimacy is, but just as we begin to think about it, do you have some starting points or reoccurring themes as the idea presents itself, just to, without unduly stacking the deck in advance, just to sort of give us a go place?
Yes. So I suppose a helpful starting point is the distinction between descriptive and normative concept of legitimacy. A descriptive concept of legitimacy relates to whether citizens believe that a government has the right to make the decisions they make, has the right to be in place and hold these posts in the first place. So it believes that the laws that they enact are fine, as in at least they've had permission to make those laws. That's the descriptive one. It's about what people feel about the regime they're under. And then a normative concept of legitimacy is, should they have the permissions to make those decisions? And are the decisions actually binding on the citizens? Should they respect those decisions? And then if we take that route, if we're interested in legitimacy as a normative concept, what sort of normative expectations do we have towards politicians and the decisions that they make? Then there are then, of course, the questions about, well, what determines the permission to make binding political decision and so on. And then we start talking about different conceptions of political legitimacy understood normatively.
So, in very simple terms, the concept might be something like that which gives people in power the right to exercise the power. And then within that concept, there's different conceptions of, in virtue of what might they have that right.
So I think that's an important component of legitimacy. It's an important question we can ask when we're interested in political legitimacy. It covers what's often described as the authority aspect. Does government have the authority to make those decisions? Does it have the right to make those decisions? But there's the other aspect. Are the decisions binding on the citizens? That's the political obligation aspect. And in my understanding, political legitimacy tries to cover both, right? Who has authority, who has political authority, and what sort of political obligations do the citizen have in relation to authoritatively made decisions?
So in simple, concrete terms, when might I feel like I have an obligation to go along with a law or a policy that I don't like? When might I think I don't like this, but...
Yeah, exactly. So take the case often discussed, right, of COVID restrictions, right, lockdowns. If we approach this from a descriptive point of view, we might ask, well, how do people feel about it, right? Do they feel that, yes, they are on board, right? The government had to do this, they had a right to do this, and they go along with the lockdown decisions, they uphold the law, right, or the policies, right? They don't have parties in their offices, etc. Right? That's sort of from a descriptive point of view, right? How do people behave? What are their attitudes towards the decisions that have been made? But then from a normative point of view, so again, take the lockdown decisions, did the government have the permission to make those very, drastic decisions about locking down everything, stopping restaurants from opening and so on? And should the citizens go along, right? Do they have an obligation to uphold decisions, even if they obviously don't like it, right? There's lots not to like about decisions like that, but do they have an obligation to go along?
This is a tricky question. I might be taking us further ahead in the interview than I intended. How neat and tidy is the normative descriptive distinction here? Because from analogy from, say, ethics, you might identify a source of something that makes something ethical. You might be a utilitarian and say it's about suffering. But then someone might come along with an example of, the trolley problem or whatever. There's many. But the point of the example is essentially to say, well, here's a case in doing what minimizes suffering seems really profoundly counterintuitive. What do we think about that? And different ethicists have different approaches, but often they very much will factor in the fact that the vast majority of people seem to find a particular instance non-intuitive. So I think it's an open question in ethics whether you can neatly separate our intuitions and what descriptively people do say from, say, a Kantian or utilitarian sort of top-down type framework. And a lot of ethicists would do, I don't know what Rawls does, of say you want some sort of balance between them. Would that apply to thinking about legitimacy, or do you think you can cleave out descriptive from normative?
That's a very good question. So I think, no, there's obviously overlap. So in the first instance, there's overlap from a prudential point of view. No government, even suppose it has in some sort of normative sense the right to make political decisions, and citizens have an obligation if, in fact, right, the citizens rebel. Well, they you just, there's not much good from a prudential point of view of insisting on your right to go ahead, right? So from a prudential point of view, in any case, any government has to sort of factor in what the mood of the citizens is. So that's sort of one area of overlap. But also then, depending on your conception of political legitimacy, you very much think that the people ought to influence, right? Who has the right to make political decisions and ought to influence what sort of obligations that they have. And that can be for various reasons. It can be from a moral point of view, right? Your own judgments matter, right? That's another blurring of the distinction. But it could also be from a sort of epistemic point of view. If people rebel, that's because they perhaps have evidence that the government didn't take into account, right? So there could be different ways of accounting for why the people's judgments matter. And where we therefore have a blurring of the normative and the descriptive.
Yeah, it strikes me that that's the case with a lot of the big political.
That's right. But
concepts.
I suppose one way, absolutely. But then one way, I suppose, to understand the difference between the normative and the descriptive is that the descriptive is only asking about, how do people feel about these things, as opposed to perhaps also, are they on good grounds, right? Then again, there's a further complication, right? That because, of course, how people feel may be driven by what they judge ought to be the case, right? Who ought to make the decisions and what decisions ought they make and, what are they bound by? So there's blurring coming from both directions, if you like.
What distinguishes political legitimacy from other big political concepts? So justice, freedom, equality. Because one thing I've heard said, it's probably more fair with some people than it is with others, is we all kind of have an instinct that legitimacy is a thing. But when you ask people to give an account of it, what you tend to get is people sort of describing the thing that they want to happen anyway. So someone who's a strong Democrat might say, well, legitimacy is when decisions are authorized by the people and it goes through these procedural constraints and checks and balances, and all they've sort of done is describe what they think a good free democracy is. Is there something that clearly distinguishes legitimacy from, say, democracy or, say, justice as bringing something to the table on its own?
I think so, but that's disputed. It's disputed in different ways. As you say, of course, there's always sort of bias, right? When we do normative theories, there's always the risk that we're just trying to articulate what we believe anyway, sort of where our moral judgments lie anyway. But more sort of systematically, there are some people who think that a permission to make binding political decisions requires justice, right? Only just decisions can be legitimate. So then there's no sharp distinction. In fact, there's sort of no distinction because justice is the sort of reigning virtue, and legitimacy just falls under it, right? Well, if we tie the normative concept of legitimacy to the permission to make binding decision, someone who has a moralized conception of legitimacy of this kind would just say, yes, that that permission to make binding decision obtains just in case the decisions are just, or the procedures are just, or whatever. So as long as the requirements of justice are met. Other people push back against it. They say there's some air between justice and legitimacy, right? A political decision can be legitimate without being just, at least within reason, right? A totally unjust decision is probably not legitimate, but there can be that legitimacy can be met more easily than justice. A legitimate decision can fail to be fully just, but still there can be that permission to make that decision, and it's binding on the citizen. That was Rawls's view, right? He, as he puts it in his influential article on the reply to Habermas, is that political legitimacy is a weaker normative concept than justice. So that's one way to think about it. We should lower our expectations when it comes to how we assess the normative merits of our political systems and the decisions made within them. There's still a normative demand on them, and it might be desirable that they move us towards justice, but there's a sense in which some normative expectations are met even when there's a shortfall relative to justice. So I think that view is right, that legitimacy does serve a certain normative need in that way. And then when it comes to these relation to other concepts, you mentioned democracy, freedom, equality. That's then one way to think about legitimacy. What are the requirements of legitimacy, as in what's the overlap with these other normative commitments that we might have, the commitment to democracy, the commitment to freedom and equality. And so some people would have argued that only democratic decisions that in some way respect freedom and equality are legitimate. That's sort of a substantive view about what legitimacy is. I think we can then still ask a further question: is that correct, or is it possible that there are decisions that are legitimate even if they are made in a different way, non-democratically? So yeah, that's the sort of a normative approach to sort of grappling with what is legitimacy, what does it require, and how does it relate to these other normative concepts: justice, democracy, freedom, equality, etc. I now think that while this is a helpful approach, there's a further approach that has not been discussed so far, but that probably would take us a bit too far ahead now.
Feel free to go into whatever you want. I mean, to maybe try and put a bit more concreteness into the question. What's the work that it does in the world? We can talk about, there's the question of how does it relate to these other concepts. But so, I put together an edited volume on freedom recently, and one of the questions I kept asking myself was, if this simply, given that freedom seems to just mean literally anything at times, people have had such different ideas of it. And even the same people can have radically different ideas of it. If it just went away, if we just stopped using it, if nobody ever talked about freedom again, would anything really be lost? And I sort of put that question to myself, and I could give my answer, but I put the same question to you. Could we just live without legitimacy? Is it doing something that could not be served by merely sort of having a slightly weaker conception of justice? If we merely talked about just actions and somewhat just actions, would we lose anything in that world?
Yes, I would say so, right? I do think that legitimacy sets a normative benchmark with regard to what we should expect of political decision makers, governments, etc., and the citizens. I suppose the thought behind this is we live in an unjust world, right? So we can strive to move towards more justice, and then there will be disagreements about justice. And that obviously just will go on, these debates about what justice requires and how we can make our societies more just, etc. I think the idea that that governments, political decision makers are under certain specific expectations, if you call it weaker justice specific to the permission to make binding political decisions, fine, but might as well use the short version, legitimacy, for it, right? I think it does meet a specific need.
That was very much my answer with freedom is, could you just stop using the word? Yes, but what you'd find is people constructing long, unwieldy sentences that were sort of just saying the word in another way. You wouldn't quite get it. It's serving a need that couldn't quite be met by anything else.
Yeah.
So you mentioned one way that people think about legitimacy is as relating to not just democracy, but more broadly, I guess, like the popular will. The legitimate decisions are those that are authorized by the people in some sense. Could you maybe sort of say a bit more about that? And I believe in your book you offer a typology, because there's different ways within that people might think about that.
Indeed. So thank you. So in the book, I do two things, or perhaps I do too many things, but out of the many things I do two. One is I argue that rather than just focusing on the relationship between different normative concepts, as we've talked about, legitimacy and authority and obligation and justice and democracy, it helps to actually ask more fundamentally, what are the sources of legitimacy? What makes political decisions legitimate? That sort of move is very familiar in ethics. In virtue of what are some actions morally right? Is it because there are some objective moral facts, or is it because people feel that they're right, or is it because it corresponds to sort of virtues development, etc.? So a familiar move in ethics, but a move that's not often made in political philosophy. I think it's helpful because I suppose, as the discussion so far already illustrates, debates about the legitimacy are getting quite messy, right? The worry about legitimacy, about this specific normative need, have been going on for a long time in Western philosophy. As a result, the debates are very fine-grained. When we go to this more sort of fundamental question, what are the sources of legitimacy? I find it sort of simplifies. So I'm doing that. I'm sort of arguing for that move. And it simplifies because, and that's the sort of typology that you mentioned, we can distinguish between three broad families of conceptions of legitimacy and this sort of wilderness that there is out there in debates about political legitimacy. A first family is what I call will-based conceptions of political legitimacy. That is, conceptions that have some commitment to the idea that the permission to make binding political decisions depends somehow on the citizens' will. And there are different ways this is cashed out. Democracy is one. And then there are other ways of answering the question in virtue of what are political decisions legitimate. The will idea, the idea that it's the political will, is the most popular one, is the most articulated one. But the two alternatives are one where cognitive authority is the source, that is, it's some sort of position of epistemic advantage, knowing better. And then the third, which is the least explored, but again, interesting because in other areas of philosophy, that's a very popular view. So when we apply it to legitimacy, the thought is that political decisions are legitimate just in virtue of the fact that they are the right decisions, the decisions we should have made. Forget about whether people want the decisions or support the decisions, or whether anyone is able to tell you it's the right decision. It's just simply in virtue of the fact that it's the right decision. I call this a factualist view of political legitimacy.
And you're going to ultimately offer a sort of blended account.
Yeah.
If we start with the will-based ones, I guess this is a tradition that starts with what, like contract theory, but then, yeah. Is there a typology within that one of like different approaches to will-based ones? Because it seems like that actually, yeah, the will of the people. Sure, that means quite different things to different people.
Indeed, yes. So I mentioned that the sort of will-based conceptions, the ones that think that political legitimacy depends on the will of the people, are the most popular ones. But yes, they haven't been around for forever. It is, as you mentioned, the social contract theorists that strengthen that view. That's really articulated that view. Hobbes is sort of often cited as an early defender, but we can go back even slightly further, the early sort of pre-social contract thought. So yes, so then within that tradition of will-based conceptions, I can identify three main lines of thought. One is the Hobbesian, which I call a unanimity conception, which is the idea that political decisions are legitimate in virtue of all citizens somehow approving. So that can again be cashed out in different ways. One important way in which it is articulated, starting with also Locke, then who wrote after Hobbes, is a consent theory, right? Political decisions are only legitimate if every citizen consents. Quite a demanding conception of political legitimacy. I think it's also somewhat misguided, but anyway, that's sort of one interpretation of this unanimity conception. A different way of thinking about how the political will shapes legitimacy is what I call a participation conception. So again, there's a sort of a family of those. Rousseau is sometimes cited in this regard. More recently, Carol Pateman, Bernard Manin, who recently died, a political theorist. They hold that what matters for political legitimacy, that everyone had an opportunity to articulate their perspective, their political views. So participation rather than unanimity. So it's a procedural view rather than the outcome view of the unanimity conceptions. And then a third family of will-based conceptions has its origin in Kant and then famously articulated by John Rawls, which is that the view is that political decisions are legitimate if they are justified on the basis of reasons the citizens can share. So it's not just whether they approve, and it's not just whether they had a chance to express their approval. It's about whether the reasons for approving are the right ones, and whether they're reasons that the citizens can share.
So you mentioned in passing that you don't hold much stock in consent-based theories. And my reaction was very, very similar. That just feels like it doesn't work to me. But you go first. Why does consent in this context not do the work that people want it to?
Okay, it'd be interesting to hear your perspective. So just first to clarify, I think consent does important work in some moral contexts, especially sort of in small scale contexts.
This is my, yeah.
Right. So like in a medical intervention, people often talk about sexual ethics and consent, the role of consent in that context. But in a political context, we are talking about decisions that affect everyone. And it seems to me what matters more for determining the legitimacy of those decisions got to have something to do with how these decisions are justified and not just with whether every single citizen approves. I mean, part of the worry, of course, is it's very difficult to find political decisions that everyone approves. And then the next thought is, if a decision is well justified, but someone happens to not give their consent, well, I just don't think that's then the right, that needs to undermine the political legitimacy. To clarify further, of course, there can be value in hearing the dissent. So if people don't agree, I think there's often then sort of something that we might be overlooking, that they might have evidence, that I mentioned that earlier, that we might be overlooking. So we need to take dissent very seriously. But that's different from thinking that an individual citizen's consent to a decision that affects so many people. Think about a decision to legislate abortion in a particular way. Your own political judgment as such need not undermine an otherwise legitimate decision, is the thought.
Yeah. I mean, where I came from on that is, I think in a lot of debates you mentioned sexual ethics. Another one that I've spent a bit of time on would be workplace ethics. What we're often doing is we start from a quite simple model of freedom bounded by consent and then nuance and complicate it, right? So you might say, oh, well, an employer can freely contract with an employee, but then someone like Elizabeth Anderson might come along and say, but the employer has far more power, so is it really consensual, ... But in all those cases, you're sort of getting a little bit away from the consent model, but you never quite escape it. I think even the accounts that really challenge it never quite get escape velocity. They end up in orbit around it. Same with sexual ethics, freedom bounded by consent, okay, but what if someone's pressured? What if... And then we qualify it and we start saying things like informed consent, enthusiastic consent, and fine, good even, but you never quite, you're in orbit around the thing. You haven't quite got escape velocity from it. I think, that doesn't make sense when it comes to thinking about what justifies a political structure, because we're doing the same thing of like, okay, it's consent, but we need to qualify, and like, in that case, I think we do actually want to get escape velocity from it. We're not just qualifying, because as you say, it is an individual relation between an employee and employer, but you want to think about maybe the social context in which it's happening. It is an individual relationship of having a relationship or having sex with someone, but then yes, let's think about the social context in which it happens. It's not an individual relation. There's no two people contracting at the heart of this. You can create a fictive account as a metaphor, and that might be a more or less useful metaphor, but it is just a metaphor. There is no actual social contract, anyway, that's my thought.
Yeah, I think so. That moves along very similar lines. So perhaps a further addition is sometimes people distinguish between actual consent and hypothetical consent. So they say, okay, so in a political context, we don't ask for actual consent, for some reasons related to the worries we've just both articulated, but hypothetical consent, right? That's the sort of consent we mean, right? That's the consent that does the justificatory work or the legitimizing work, where hypothetical consent is consent under some idealized conditions, right? Someone would consent if blah, blah. It seems to me, well, that's fine, but just call it justification, right? Just drop the consent, right? It's not a consent view. It's a view of under what condition political decisions in this political context are justified. So I would call this a justificationist view of political legitimacy. Hypothetical consent views are part of the justificationist views as an alternative to actual consent views, which are not justificationist. They demand consent. But there are other justificationist views as well, including Raz's well-known service conception of legitimate political authority and so on. So the justificationist family is very broad, but it's a clear alternative to the actual consent views.
What do you make of the Rawlsian ones, that it's about public reason and all that? My concern with those, and it's a potential concern because not all Rawlsians do go down this. I just interviewed Gabriele Badano and Alessia Nuti, who very clearly don't go, who are Rawlsians, but very clearly don't go down this road. Of my fear with the sort of public reason, and it's about an overlapping consensus of reasons that can appeal to, is it one can have a conservatizing bent in that we're going to constrain policy to what can achieve the broadest possible consensus, and then certain groups can kind of act as a veto to that. The other is, I think that model can downplay the fact that any political system will have to coerce some people who don't want to go along with it, that you'll never get true, complete consensus on anything. And the sort of public reason model can potentially, and I say potentially, be a bit naive about that fact, although not all Rawlsians are, as I mentioned. But that's my concerns about the Rawls model.
Good. Yeah, that's interesting. So I also have reservations. I have to perhaps disclose, get full disclosure. So I used to be quite convinced by the Rawlsian model, at least under a particular interpretation, which is slightly different from the one that sort of seems to have become the dominant interpretation of Rawls. But I now think actually it's not quite right. It's at least not complete. So the sort of conservative worry, I think, yes, is certainly a legitimate one. I suppose the way in which Rawlsians answer it is say, well, it's not conservative because there's this very progressive commitment to freedom and equality built in. That is, the reasons we can share are reasons that are consistent with the fundamental equality and freedom of everyone, and that's a very progressive idea. However, that runs into a different problem, which is, well, are you just privileging a particular moral point of view, right, to the exclusion of alternatives, right? Are you being hegemonic in a sort of weird way? And I think there is something to that, right, that people do disagree about the requirements of justice. We talked about this earlier, and to just sort of take it for granted that they can't disagree about freedom and equality is a bit dogmatic. So either way, we're in trouble, right? We're either too conservative or too dogmatic. So then there's a further worry, which is the one that I articulate in the book, and I call this the arbitrariness objection. I think it affects all will-based conceptions of political legitimacy, not just the Rawlsian one, but it affects the Rawlsian one too. And that is that just thinking about the reasons we can share, or what everyone could consent to, or how we sort of, take into account the people's different views, allow them to articulate their perspectives, isn't really sufficiently well connected to trying to get to the right decisions. Because think about the analogy to science. Yes, we want to hear the views of different scientists. We want them to critically engage with each other. We want them to aim for consensus, but that's not all of it, right? Not any consensus will do. We want them to try and figure out how the world works, right? And reach consensus on that. And it seems to me that all will-based conceptions sort of lack that link to understanding the political process as having to be linked somehow to trying to make the right decisions. So that's another worry I have with the public reason conceptions, is that they're not sufficiently tied to trying to get it right.
Which brings us on to, I guess, what you could call epistemic or cognitive authority conceptions. I must admit, I'm instinctively a little cautious of these, because
you're not the only one.
I guess my starting point would be, I'm just not sure that's something a liberal democracy does. Like, democracy avoids some of the worst outcomes that other systems can have. It produces certain goods. The idea of it as a truth-seeking mechanism seems to be expecting something of it that it rarely, if ever, delivers. Democracies can create spaces within them for universities or scientific research or so on, which then act as truth-seeking mechanisms. The idea that the thing itself seems optimistic to me.
Good. Yes, I agree. So just to sort of perhaps backtrack slightly, right? So if we talk about the view that political legitimacy isn't just a matter of reaching agreement among people, whatever their beliefs are, but somehow needs to factor in or distinguish between decision-making processes that are better or less well able to track the truth. So what's called epistemic conceptions of democracy defend democracy not because it's a way of respecting everyone's freedom and equality, but because they argue democracy or democratic procedures are better able to track the right decisions than other systems. Now, I have some sympathy to the views, partly because, as you just mentioned, democratic institutions seem to also then support these sort of further knowledge-producing institutions such as universities and other sort of the free press and so on, right, that are conducive to the search for truth. But to think that democracies are inherently better able at getting the right decisions is difficult to defend from an empirical point of view, and difficult to defend also from a sort of theoretical point of view, because the models that have been put forward to explain this capacity of democracies all rely on assumptions which are not always easy to meet.
Yeah, no, I remember being very taken by this when I was an undergrad, which is a certain amount of time ago, and you Condorcet jury theorem and
exactly.
Arrow's impossibility theorem, all very clever, and you feel very smart for wrapping your head around it, and it's fun, right? But then
where I started with my PhD dissertation, Arrow's impossibility theorem, all that.
Really, I got obsessed with that in my.
It is nice, isn't it?
It is a very engaging intellectual project, but then at some point, our models of the world, even our normative models of the world, have to correspond to the world. And even if what you end up with is less elegant and less clever, and you end up saying stuff that is seemingly vapid, as like the political is the realm of contestation, like at least it's not as obviously jarringly at odds with the world as the assumptions of the impossibility theorem are like, those are never, not all of those are never going to be met simultaneously. Like, we have to be engaged in what economic and political systems are actually doing, right?
Yeah. So I agree with that. But there's still, it seems to me, and I hope that sort of one of the things that the book does is to draw our attention to the fact that there are these different ways of thinking about the way in which political processes contribute to the legitimacy of the decisions made. One is they bring people's perspective together. They offer opportunities for the citizens to articulate their will. That's the will-based conceptions we talked about. And the other is these processes somehow enable us to make the right decisions. Whether these are democratic procedures, as articulated in sort of Condorcet jury theorem theory of epistemic democracies, or alternative theories of the epistemic merits of democracy, or whether these are non-democratic theories, right? So some people are drawn to epistocracy, the thought that we should leave political decision-making to the experts, always with a bit of a question mark. Well, who are these experts? They're not easy to find either, right? But these are just very different ways of thinking about the sources of political legitimacy. And it's just helpful to get a grip on these two different options, and potentially of how we can bring them together. That would be then my favorite view. As you mentioned, it's a blended approach. I'd say both matter, and for different reasons, both dimensions matter for legitimacy.
So tell me, what's your account? How do you bring those two together?
Right. So the way I bring the two together is I acknowledge, following the epistemic Democrats, but up to a point also the epistocrats, that there's something to be said if political procedures, political processes, political institutions are set up in such a way that we end up with the decisions we have most justification to believe are the right ones. So epistemic advantage, if a particular political process, right, has more epistemic advantage built in than another, that's relevant for thinking about the legitimacy of this process, of these procedures, of the decisions made in this way. So I share that. But I also think that against both the epistemic Democrats and the epistocrats, we shouldn't expect too much. The normal case in politics is that we don't know what we're doing, right? And political processes are dysfunctional, right? So we can't rely on them generating the right decisions, right? And there's no one to turn to, no experts to turn to ask what the right decisions are, because it's contested. It's contested all the way down. That's the normal case in politics. I mentioned the COVID example earlier, right? I have a particular view of what happened right at the start of the pandemic, where I think there was actually some very robust expert-led consensus in this case about the needs for lockdown, which my view is sufficient for the legitimacy of those decisions. But the normal case is, and we saw that in the discussions around COVID, and we still see it, right? They are the public health experts, in disagreement with the economists and the education experts, mental health experts, right, about what the right response is. That's the normal case, disagreement all the way down. And that's where I think, therefore, the will of the citizens comes in, right? If we have no way of identifying the right decisions, no procedures to rely on, no experts to turn to, then, well, we're to our own devices, right? We just have to somehow rely on the citizens' political will, and understand political legitimacy as an appropriate response to the citizens' own political judgments. So that's the blended view. If you can have it, great. If you can have cognitive authority as the ground of legitimacy, great, but normally not available. And so normally it's the will of the citizens that's the ground of political legitimacy.
It seems like one of the both from what you just said and from your work, one of the things that's sort of really motivating you to get to like a bit of both is the sort of emergency case. Like an electorate might authorise the government to do X, Y, and Z, but then COVID happens or what have you, any sort of big emergency that would take them, the response to which may very well take them completely beyond anything the electorate authorised them to do. And we still need a framework for thinking about, is that decision legitimate or not? And it has, and your worry is it has to be at least potentially, right? There has to be some potential for a government to do something way beyond anybody authorised them to do in a true extreme case.
Yes, so I think emergency scenarios are one where we perhaps are more likely to see the potential of cognitive political authority, because it focuses the mind, right? Because if there's a lot at stake and no time to deliberate, right? Say with COVID, right, an infectious disease, potential to kill millions and millions and millions, right, and no immunity, you've got to act fast. And if there's previous experience, tried and tested, as it appeared to have been the case here with other outbreaks of new infectious diseases, which showed that lockdown is an appropriate response, right, and that seemed to have been a very strong consensus from different types of experts. With experience in this case, so both also epidemiologists with experience in modeling, but also sort of public health specialists with experience on the ground of how to manage a disease outbreak, etc., all coming together with there's only one response at this point, right? So, however, it's important to highlight that still the demands on legitimacy are steep, right? We are asking we're asking whether there is anyone we can turn to with sufficiently robust epistemic authority on what the right decision is. Often emergencies are chaos situations, right? Which case we won't have this sort of epistemic authority either. So it's not the case that in all emergency scenarios we should cut democratic influence. Not at all, right? Quite the opposite, precisely because they can be so chaotic. But if there's less time to deliberate, if there are these pressures to focus the mind, that at least potentially, right, there could be cognitive authority emerging. This said, as mentioned earlier, right, normally we are in disagreement, and this disagreement matters. I also think that in addition to sort of emergency scenarios, there's also quite a lot of delegated decision-making going on in democracies. Take a health service, right? Making a lot of decisions about rationing. I think some of that is, to the extent that it is legitimate, might also have its ground in epistemic advantage. People who have actually thought through a lot of cases, have experience on how to make these trade-offs about what to fund, what not to fund, should be contestable, right? They might make the wrong decisions, in which we're back to the scenario where the political will is the ground of political legitimacy. But I suppose we also find in those sort of delegated decision-making scenarios, agencies which potentially have their legitimacy on the ground of their epistemic advantage.
You prioritise the epistemic side over the will side in cases where we can clearly know the epistemic side. What about cases where what we know, what we have good scientific reason to know, is still nonetheless a source of real contention? So to give you a case, there is a widespread popular belief that vaccines cause autism. This is almost certainly not true. As much as we know as much as we can say anything isn't true, this isn't true. What about a hypothetical where a majority of an electorate came to believe this and elected a government specifically democratically empowered by a large majority to ban vaccines on that basis? Would them doing so then be legitimate? And why?
Good. Yeah, good. Nice. So that's a very good example, I think. So the way I think about the requirements for cognitive authority is on the basis of three layers. So cognitive authority is very demanding. There are 3 conditions that need to be met, and each of them is difficult to meet in the sort of actual circumstances of politics. The first, there has to be a unified body of evidence. So let's go quickly back to the COVID example. I mentioned that there was sort of consensus from sort of the modeling people and the sort of community specialists, etc. So there we have evidence that's very different, data sets on the one hand and sort of local experience on the other in different countries around the world, integrating, right, as a sort of shared body of evidence supporting a particular response. The typical scenario in politics is that we have these pockets of evidence, these different bodies of evidence. People base their political beliefs on bodies of evidence that are not well integrated. And I think the vaccine case is one. People who firmly believe that these vaccines cause autism draw on some sources, right? They're not just making this up, right? They have probably read quite a bit, which confirms the belief that this is so. Unfortunately, it's not well integrated, the body of evidence they rely on with the body of evidence that the scientists who study this correlation and come to the conclusion there is no correlation rely on, right? So I suppose one task would be to see, can we unify these bodies of evidence a bit better? Challenging. So far we're failing, right? So first problem. Next and related problem is, do we even have anyone with expertise, over a unified body of evidence? So even if we managed to unify the body of evidence, we might still have just specialist expertises, like on how to go back to the COVID example, how to model infectious disease outbreaks versus how to manage it in a community, right? Very different kinds of expertises. But what we need in the political domain is expertise on what should we do, right? So integrated expertise, very difficult to achieve in the vaccine case. So we have that problem too, right? So we're failing at the level of the body of evidence, but even if we try to achieve that, people might still then have specialist expertises that don't integrate. And then there is the third level, equally challenging, is how to identify the experts, right? So we might fail at that hurdle, that the people who believe in the correlation might still think, well, actually, but my expert still insists, right, that we need to, stop all these vaccines immediately, right? So there might be no agreement at that level. When we have no agreement in this way, then relying on the political will is legitimate in my theory. Now I need to add a wrinkle to that. It's legitimate if the stories, as I've told, we just fail at these 3 levels or at any one of those 3 levels. However, I think that when we're deciding whether we meet the conditions I just articulated, we shouldn't just depend on the evidence people happen to consider and the belief they happen to have. We also need to consider whether there's evidence that they should consider, that the evidence that they do have but have failed to consider. So there the burden is also, say, now on the people believing in the correlation between autism and certain vaccines to engage with the counter evidence. I call this epistemic accountability for action, that you're doing something wrong, again, especially in a political context, if you're advocating for political beliefs while failing to fully consider all the evidence available, where the evidence available isn't just first order evidence, the data, but also testimony. Have you really taken seriously the testimony available about the failure to demonstrate this correlation? So they're on they have a certain burden of proof here. So it's still possible that the stories, as I told it first, we fail at all 3 levels, but it's also possible that we don't fail, as in that the issue is that some vaccine skeptics have failed to consider integrated evidence, have failed to listen to testimony where it's available, and the disagreement across experts is a fake one, right? So that's the alternative possibility. If that's the story, then the scenario that you described, then there would be no legitimacy to that sort of election.
So, by analogy, when you talk about epistemic accountability in an individual case, say I go to the garage to get my car checked out, and the mechanic who knows more about cars than me says, your brakes aren't working, this is not safe to drive, it needs to go in for repairs. And I say, oh, well, I read something online that I can just do this. And I drive my car, and the brakes indeed don't work, and I'm in a crash, and a family member is killed. In that case, someone could turn to me and say, what were you thinking? You had a responsibility to take seriously what this mechanic was saying, and me saying, oh, but I have this other source of evidence, actually kind of doesn't cut it. You should have known better. Not in the I should have known everything about the car. I should have known better in who I placed my trust. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
That's exactly what I'm trying to get at. That's a really nice example. Should have added that in the book. But what we're seeing, it's not just a prudential
and it's not just doing
issue.
that in the case of an individual, it's doing that in the case of a society.
Exactly, right?
Like at some point you can say to people, you should have known better. You should have trusted people who you have good reasons to trust.
Exactly. So you're putting other people at risk, right? In this failure to consider evidence that you've had that was available to you, and that's a moral problem. So it affects your accountability. People can rightly turn to you and blame you for what you've done, right?
So in the case of a population authorizing a government to ban vaccines, that would be the sort of legitimacy concern there is. It's not that there's agreement, there is not. It's that epistemic accountability, you should have listened to the mechanic about the brakes.
Exactly. So that's the alternative story, right? So with the vaccine example, right? So one possibility is, yes, we're failing to integrate the evidence, right? That there are people who have some evidence about vaccine that's not properly integrated with the scientific evidence. It's always a possibility, right? We need to be open to that. To give you an example to demonstrate this possibility, there's quite a lot of interesting work done on the Flint water crisis. So that was a problem where the locals said, so the citizens of Flint said there's a problem with our water, and the experts said, oh, it's fine, just go ahead, drink it. And this went on for years and years and years until it was demonstrated that, of course, the water was polluted and a health risk. So the citizens were right. So it's always possible, right, that there are different bodies of evidence that are not well integrated. So we need to take that seriously. Similarly, then with the other two levels, we need to take that possibility seriously. But, and that's sort of an important point in the book, disagreement, as you described it, is not sufficient. Not any disagreement will do, right? We need to ask, could you have known better? Could you know better? Is there evidence you have failed to consider? And given how much is at stake here, COVID, climate change are examples, right, where we can see that there's a huge amount at stake. So it's like in the car case, important that you consider the evidence that is available to you.
What about in cases where it's not exactly the unanimity of evidence or the quality of evidence in question, it's that evidence conflicts with other values we may hold. So take the case of Brexit. Now, it's not universal, but I think that the expert consensus before and after was that particularly a harder form of Brexit probably would be damaging economically with respect to a number of key variables that we might care about. That's not universal. There's some people who would argue otherwise, but let's even just say that it was. I don't think that's what motivated the Brexit project. I think it was concerns about ideas like sovereignty. Now I don't particularly buy into that version of sovereignty when people are like, regulations need to be made in the UK. Do I personally care exactly where the regulation on the comparative levels of noise that a lawnmower can emit are made in EU or the UK? No, I don't. But it seems many people really did. Many people felt quite strongly about this issue of sovereignty. And even with the COVID case, I'm not sure at its heart that opposition was about efficacy. I think it was about freedom, a vision of freedom that I would challenge in some respects, but nonetheless. And I don't mean to be wholly dismissive. I think there probably are cases where something on balance might not be particularly evidence-based and there might be a cost incurred in doing it, but we have just a sort of moral issue at play that we care about. How do you think about those cases?
Good, nice. So let's go back to the COVID case first, and the freedom worry that you mentioned, which sort of ties in nicely with what we talked about earlier about freedom. Yes, right. So immediately, right, with at the start of the pandemic, with the lockdown, right, there were the libertarians very worried about freedom. Is this a sort of unjustified constraint on people's freedom? My sense is that the reason why this wasn't such a weighty response or a weighty objection is, I think Habermas articulated something similar, and I don't all that often find myself on Habermas' side of things, but in that case I do, is that freedom just appeals for freedom just don't have that much weight when the risk is that everyone dies, right? It's all very well to appeal to freedom under the assumption you're going to live, but not so much if everyone's lives are at stake. So it wasn't a weighty objection is the thought here. So it's not so we can't just juxtapose expertise on the one hand and values. It's rather the expertise, if it's of the right kind, to be a ground of legitimacy, has to be expertise that factors in value judgment, right? And the thought is freedom just isn't a very weighty concern when everyone's lives are at stake. So
what about the Brexit case, though?
Exactly. So the Brexit case,
freedom, right? Or
yeah.
a conception thereof, yeah, versus maybe we have 2% less economic growth. What if people are like, eyes wide open, I'll make that trade? Right. I wouldn't, good, but some people will bite that bullet.
Yeah. Good. So so absolutely. So again, we shouldn't be juxtaposing sort of expertise versus values, but rather the expertise of the right kind would have to factor in those values, those potential trade-offs, right? Like you say, between potentially opportunities to control the laws that a country makes versus effects on economic growth. These are all values, right? So, as we only have political expertise if these values are appropriately responded to. And I can see some tensions that are irresolvable through expertise. There are just different views. There's disagreement all the way down, right, about what matters more. And when disagreement morally about what matters more, but also a sort of an empirical disagreement. Do you actually have control out of the EU? No, forget it, because we still have to cooperate. They're still our trading partner, right? Versus what are the prospects of a Singaporean or Swiss, for that matter, financial haven in London, and so on. So there are empirical disagreements as well as value disagreements here at stake. My own view is that, everything considered, it was probably clear ahead of time that Brexit was a mistake, and people who supported Brexit often did so on the basis of information that would have been easily we would have been easily be able to show is inadequate. But it was messy all round, so I'm much less confident about that case than I am about the early COVID case. But that's just to reinforce the sort of problem that I'm very much aware of, that the normal case in politics is messy, which is why we can't rely on epistemic advantage as a ground of legitimacy.
It wasn't a good project. It's not a project, the Brexit project. It's not one I support. Was it a legitimate one?
Yeah, so I would say that there weren't good grounds for Cameron to call the referendum. The fact that you wanted to be re-elected is not a good reason, right? So the problem is there, right? Rather than, so I think perhaps in the details of how the referendum was run, the information that was available, and so on. Actually, we should probably, what the illegitimate move was to call for an unprepared referendum, and then perhaps also later stages, because even with the early referendum, right, there would still have been more options than were then taken by politicians. So yeah, I would say the issues were, was this really, I think we probably would have I can say that there was epistemic authority on the fact that this was a bad idea to call a referendum on this.
How would you feel? We talked about a potential values versus sort of evidence.
Yeah.
This is just a thought that occurs to me, and I don't have like a big philosophical theory behind it. It's just something I think that might be descriptively true. How would you feel about values as a source of political legitimacy? Here's what I mean by that. I think when we elect governments, we're by and large not electing a particular slate of policies or even personnel. I think people vote on an overarching values vision. So to take the sort of extreme case, you might get a socialist party that says, we very strongly believe in material equality, and people vote. There might also be cases, not even emergencies, but just new information, new scenarios that we haven't considered before. We expect that government to make decisions in accordance with that. We expect if there's a nurses' strike, the socialist government we've elected will be sympathetic to the workers in that strike, right? We don't know in advance what the outcome will be because we don't know what the situations will be, but we're electing like an orientation of people to the role. And I think descriptively, that is how a lot of people assess legitimacy. I think, to do a parable from the UK, the Blair government would run on just the most minimal stuff. They'd run on like, we're going to raise education spending by 1%. They'd do it in their first month in office, and that would be that. But people accepted it as legitimate because they were empowering a set of values, which is free market, accepting a lot of the Thatcher stuff Thatcher did, but more cozy, more progressive, a bit centre-left about it, and pragmatic and sort of technocratic. That's what we were empowering. And as long as they did it, people were fine with it. When the Iraq War happened, I think why people perceived it as illegitimate was, one, in retrospect, it was a bad decision, but two, that was clearly motivated by a value set quite different to the one that we'd empowered, or the most recent Tory government. I think people started to find it illegitimate because we had three changes, not just in leadership, but in the whole package of values that the government was assessing things by. And I think it wasn't just that we didn't empower that set of policies. There's always going to be policies that, oh, there was a tax shortfall, we need to do this. We didn't empower that set of values. I think, so I don't know, that's like a long story, but how do you think about that?
Yeah, good. So the reason why I think elections, as long as they're run, according to some democratic principles and fairly and all that, are a source of legitimacy, that in deciding who should represent us, there is no cognitive authority, right? So in my sort of scheme, right, political decisions are legitimate if they're based, so only it's in virtue of the epistemic advantage that they are based on, if available, but if not available, in virtue of the political will. Well, in deciding who should lead a country, who should represent a constituency, there is no cognitive authority, right? There are just disagreements, including about values, right? So therefore, to let these values be a guide is absolutely fine, because there is just no other basis. That said, there are limits, right? So not any values will do, and not any majoritarian decision making will do. I'd say, for example, I think we have moral knowledge about the badness of genocide. We might disagree about what is and isn't genocide, but we have a moral agreement, no moral knowledge about the badness of genocide. So a majoritarian endorsement of a genocidal government doesn't give you legitimacy, because there we run up against the constraints of cognitive authority, if that helps.
That might, I would possibly draw a bit of a legitimacy distinction between, say, Brexit and Trump. This is just a gut
Right.
feeling. I wouldn't place too much weight on it. In that Brexit, for all that it was based on bad reasons, and for all we can quibble about the referendum, did have some sort of democratic input going into it. And it's not absolutely existential. It's bad. I think our economy is worse than it. But fine, whatever. Like, electorates will pursue bad projects, right? The Trump thing, it's the values are worse, but also the values are a threat to the system itself. There's this saying in American law that the Constitution isn't a suicide pact. And at some level, if the values are... So this is actually quite Hobbesian, right? Like Hobbes says what? Like that gives you security you owe allegiance to. I'd go a bit broader than security, maybe like a Rawlsian thin conception of the good, some minimal degree of freedom, rights, not having people take your stuff. Very, very minimal. Stability. Once you get something fundamentally hostile to that, fundamentally hostile to the project of liberal democracy, even if it's democratically authorized, like that's to my mind just too far out the park to consider legitimate.
Yeah, I have similar worries. So to perhaps add a bit to that, on the one hand, one interpretation I'm seeing now about the second round of Trump, the recent election, is that there's been a very significant cultural shift to the right.
Yes.
Which, we might not like, but if go back to what we say, there is on certain issues disagreement all the way down. They are, say, socialist visions, they are right-wing, even fascist visions, and some more centrist visions. And we have no way of displaying or identifying moral knowledge on that would allow us to rule some of those out. If at least some shift to the right is within the realm of possible disagreements we need to take seriously, well, so unfortunately it is. However, there are limits, right? As you describe it, right? If electing someone who doesn't uphold the fundamentals of the Constitution, I would have thought that does run against cognitive authority. So I'm surprised that the Republican Party ended up upholding this. And I would say I was surprised similarly by the Tories in the UK to uphold Boris Johnson as a viable candidate, because even if his offences weren't perhaps as serious as Trump's, there was a similar sort of negligence towards the core commitments of UK democracy. So I would say the parties have a certain responsibility here, even though I said at the beginning, I think that the reason why elections are a vehicle for legitimacy is because on the question who should lead, there typically is no cognitive political authority. I think there are clearly some unsuitable candidates, and the parties are there to filter them out. And then, because then the remaining disagreement is, the one that we need an election for to resolve it. But there are limits.
This is a much bigger conversation and we're coming up on time, but one point I've made repeatedly is our normative theories of democracy have to take into account political parties, because that's just how democracies operate and they run. And clearly it's not all on electorates. Like, electorates have their role and they have their responsibilities. And I think sometimes we can say electorates made a bad call. I think they did on Brexit. Fine. They did on Trump. Fine. But it's also a responsibility of parties to behave responsibly with respect to the core constraints of the system. And the Republicans definitely aren't. I think the Tories aren't as far down the road, but I can see them going down that road, unfortunately. I can very easily see that they might be there in 5 or 10 years.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the concept of epistemic accountability helps, right?
Yes.
So it's not all down to just what do the people want, right? So some sort of unconstrained toxic populism is not a source of legitimacy, and political leaders in particular and parties as sort of the institutions that organize political leadership are under expectations of epistemic accountability. That is, if there is cognitive political authority, if there is expertise of the right kind, or procedures that allow us to identify the right decisions, they ought to uphold them.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's end there then. The book that we've been referencing, which I realised we didn't name, is The Grounds of Political Legitimacy. Is there anywhere else you'd like to direct people to go? A website? Have you a Twitter or Blue Sky? I think most of us are moving over. Anywhere you'd like to send people to?
Okay, that's very kind. Thank you. Yes, so I am on less on Twitter now and more on Blue Sky. If people are interested in political legitimacy in general, rather than the specific argument I make in the book, I have a Stanford Encyclopedia article on political legitimacy, which might be helpful to people, which gives an overview.
Useful.
Yeah.
I should have read that before I interviewed you.
No,
anyway, woulda, coulda, shoulda.
There's only so much time we have.
Awesome. Fabienne, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciated that.
It was great talking to you. Enjoyed it very much.